Welcome to this video. This is an ongoing video series where I compare the differences between Photoshop and Affinity Photo, specifically the differences in tools and how they're used in both programs. There's differences that are better in Affinity Photo and vis-a-vis Photoshop. Affinity Photo is an awesome program, but there's a lot of things that Photoshop does that Affinity Photo doesn't do. Ultimately, I find that the program that works best for you really does depend on your actual workflow. I myself still find myself using Photoshop because there's certain things Affinity Photo don't do, such as support a particular plugin that just doesn't cut it with my workflow. Anyhow, today we're looking at the differences in the tool Gaussian blur. So we'll start by using Photoshop, then I'll move across to Affinity Photo. So on the left hand side is Photoshop, right hand side of course Affinity Photo. So in Photoshop, to apply a Gaussian blur, there's really only one way to do it. I'm not aware of any particular shortcut key. If you do know of one, let me know in the comments please. So you will not find Gaussian blur in an adjustment layer. You find it under Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur. When I select that, it brings up a dialog box, and in this dialog box there's a couple of options, not that many really. The first one that I'll point out is the preview option here. This preview checkbox turns on and off the preview in the main window. I always leave it on. I assume that that's probably in the past, in older versions of Photoshop, it was only available in the preview window here. Anyhow, I won't go off on that route. If I just select it on and off, it turns it on and off. Now to adjust the actual Gaussian blur, we just grab this handle here and scrub that left and right, and as we do that, you'll notice both the preview in the dialog box and also the preview in the main window are adjusted after I let go of the mouse. Now that's not the entire truth with regard to the small window here. As I scrub along, you do notice that it is kind of live. It seems delayed a little bit now, and also you can see there's some sort of flickering going on, some artifacts. There it is there. That could be video card related, specifically a driver issue or something. Not so sure about that. The delay could actually be related to the video card. But in any case, it does provide some tangible live feedback of the effect, but I don't find it useful myself because it's such a small preview that I would really want to get a big picture view of how things are working, like down below. So I usually find myself either scrubbing, letting go and getting a feel for that, or so on. But over time, I've actually discovered I tend to use a particular value, say 30 pixels, that I'll just dial in by typing in the input field, and that works fine. You can also scrub the radius title. That does the same thing. You may be familiar with that when you scrub, say, the opacity option on the toolbar for certain tools. Now I can zoom out of the frame here to get a bigger picture of how things look, so that that live preview has some sort of greater effect, but it's just too small, and I cannot change the size of this dialog box. There's no handles for me to increase the size of the window. So once I decide on the particular value I'm after, I hit OK, and it now applies that to my current stacked layer, or the current layer. Usually I would go through the process of just duplicating the layer first and then applying the Gaussian blur. So in this case, I can just go Filter, Gaussian blur here, or Hold Control F in Windows to reapply it, and it has applied it to that current layer. And then I use opacity to adjust its strength, and that's it. It's pretty simple in Photoshop. So let's move across to Affinity Photo, and first of all we'll start by applying a similar kind of Gaussian blur. Then I'll show you some pretty cool things that are unique to Affinity Photo. I'll start by duplicating the layer, Control J, so it works the same here in Affinity Photo. It's giving me a new layer. And so to apply a Gaussian blur, there's two ways we can do it actually. And I'll start with this one down here. So if you look down the bottom, you'll see there's these 4 icons. In Photoshop, we have a few more. Actually, there's probably about the same if you include the folders and so on. What I want to point out is that they are very familiar. I mean, they're pretty much the same, aren't they? Except for the adjustment icon is inverted in Affinity Photo. That's kind of funny. Okay, so if I go to this one here, which does not occur or exist in Photoshop rather, called Live Filters, I'll explain Live Filters in a different video in more detail, but here we're going to look at Gaussian Blur Filter. So when I select it, it brings up a dialog box. Now this dialog box does not have a preview dialog, or rather a preview window, because it applies the radius blur or the Gaussian blur to the main window only. And really that's really all you need, because what you really want to have is some sort of live tangible feedback about the, or some sort of live feedback with regard to the blur being applied. And so when I do this, a similar thing, and grab the handle and scrub it along, what you'll notice is a very much alive, very, very fast filter blur being applied. And that is cool. Now that's not what live actually means, although you could call it live in my opinion. Because what this does is actually quite dramatic. It changes the way that you work really, because in Photoshop I find I end up looking between, if I just put that back on, I'll go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. In Photoshop I find I end up looking at the value or scrub it along and looking down. For some reason I end up looking at the value, and it distracts me from the actual creative process itself. I find I get taken out of it, literally into the dialog box. Whereas here in Affinity Photo, it's really cool that I can just see what the effect will have right now, and I don't even look at the value actually. I just ignore it. Just scrub this in. So that's neat. That's really neat. Now, one thing that happens here in Affinity Photo doesn't happen in Gaussian Blur is it introduces an edge, what's called an alpha edge. You'll notice along the edge of the image here, it seems, I'll just zoom in here, Control 1 to go 1-to-1, and you'll see that along the edges it's basically transparent or hasn't applied a blur. Now, if there's any web designers out there, you'll know that if you apply a CSS filter blur, it does the same thing. It creates this kind of edge in. It's kind of annoying, really. Anyway, very easy to fix that. Is that using this checkbox, preserve alpha, will do just that, and it'll preserve the alpha and prevent any kind of transparency going on. So that fixes up. As soon as we're happy with it, we can just close the dialog box. But before I do that, I also would like to show you that to reset this value, if I want to like reset it to 0, I just click outside of the frame anywhere, and you can see it just resets it. I actually find that annoying myself, because sometimes I'll accidentally click or whatever and it's just reset that blur. But anyway, once I am happy with it, I can hit the X, and there we have it. It's applied the blur. Now, unlike Photoshop, where the blur has been applied to a rasterized layer, in Affinity Photo, you'll notice here we have a little arrow. An arrow represents that there's more layers or adjustments rather beneath that layer. So if I select it, it expands and shows a Gaussian blur. So when I double click on that, it reopens the Gaussian blur and allows me to make adjustments to it after the fact. That is cool. But of course, you have probably noticed you can do something similar in Photoshop if you've used smart objects before. And I'll quickly just demo that now. So if I cancel out of the Gaussian blur, I'll remove that layer, just duplicate it again. And this time I am going to convert this layer into a smart object by right clicking on it after selecting it, going convert to smart object. You can see the icon changes there to indicate it's now a smart object. And smart objects essentially allow you to add adjustments to them and filters and so on, and you can do the same thing as in Affinity Photo and make adjustments after the fact. So if I go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, let's just apply that value again. You can see now it builds up a stack of filters beneath, and using this eye here I can turn that on and off, or I can just double click in it and change that value after the fact. But that's an extra process. You first have to convert the layer into a smart object before you can apply the Gaussian blur. This is what's very unique about Affinity Photo, is that every single pixel layer, or rather you might say the equivalent would be a raster layer in Photoshop, is actually never a rasterized layer. It's always a smart object and retains all the data, information, the resolution, the size of the image is always retained no matter what. And so when you apply live filters will build them into a stack beneath that particular rasterized, or sorry, particular live layer. Okay, now I will just remove that layer in Affinity Photo just by selecting it and pressing the backspace button, key rather, and I'm going to duplicate that layer, Control J. Now there is another way you can apply a Gaussian blur inside of Affinity Photo, and that is by going to Filter, similarly as in Photoshop, Filter Blur, Gaussian blur. Now in this instance, before I show you a few other things in this particular dialog box, if I just apply this default value here and hit OK or apply, it applies it to this layer, much the same as in Photoshop. So now I have a layer that I cannot adjust that filter after the fact. But of course this works the same way as Photoshop, so it works fine. We can change the opacity. If we want to change how it blends, we can change the blend mode and so on. But if I go back up to that dialog box and go filter blur, Gaussian blur, I'm just about to show you a feature which is unique again to Affinity Photo that I think is really cool. And that is these little three icons down the bottom here. If I select, I'll start with the middle one, it's called split view. It does just that, it splits the view in half. And now I can see the effect being applied on the left hand side, of course, and the right hand side, the original. So as I change that value, it still applies that filter live or dynamically, and I get to see the original on the other side, and I can grab this handle here and change the amount of the before and after I see. And there's a few other options here. I can say no split view, which is of course the default as it is in Photoshop, and mirror view. Mirror view creates a duplicate. I'll just cancel out of that. I'm going to press tab here just so we get a bit more of a real estate, and go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And now if I go mirror, we get a duplicate of the image, which is really neat. Of course, if I was to do something similar in Photoshop, it would be quite long-winded, where I'd have to go and duplicate the image, literally, by going image, duplicate, and then again pressing tab, going up to window, arrange both vertically, and turning off one of the layers for one of them to show the original. And there we have a before and after. But of course it's not live, so and I've duplicated the image literally, or document, so it's just not something that I would actually do in practice. And that is about it. That's the difference between Affinity Photo and Photoshop with respect to Gaussian blur. And I think the Gaussian blur in Affinity Photo is that much cooler. The ability to be able to see the change live is really, really handy. You can stay focused on the creative process rather than having to manage the program per se. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will like and subscribe to the video. See you soon.